Welcome everybody to GoLocal Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. A little news before we get to Professor Lawless. First up, Governor announced 4 more deaths in Rhode Island and the closure of all state parks and beaches. This is in an effort to curtail any social interaction, and enforce social distancing as best as she can. More to come on that. Also, issues related to modeling of what the impact of the virus is. Excuse me. The president and the CDC announced that they will be releasing their federal modeling. The state is still refusing to disclose that information here in Rhode Island. We've been asking it for about 2 weeks here at GoLocal. We'll stay on top of that issue and let you know if there's a breakthrough on releasing that information. Let's go to Professor Jennifer Lawless, political science superstar down at the University of Virginia, but presently in New York City. Thanks for joining us.
Of course.
Okay, let's get to it. We were teasing before the show. I understand Donald Trump has an opponent, and the New York Times has a piece about the very, very difficult time Joe Biden has now raising money against a financial juggernaut in the Trump machine.
Right. I mean, the problem, obviously, is that it took a long time for the Democrats to basically coalesce behind a nominee. And so Democratic donors were dividing millions of dollars across a dozen candidates. Now that it's obviously pretty clear to anybody except Bernie Sanders that Joe Biden will be the nominee, this would be the time where it shouldn't be difficult for him to raise money. All of those donors come home and they support their candidate. The problem, of course, is that the economy is crashing and economic futures are uncertain. And this is not the kind of thing in terms of political giving that people, even with money, are interested in doing right now. And so that creates a major disadvantage for Biden. In the past, we've had presidential candidates that generally don't win or lose based on the amount of money they raise because they're never that far outspent from their opponent. This time, the gap is very, very substantial, and we've never been in a position like this.
Trump's, proving himself almost every day the master at manipulating his relationships with corporate America almost every day at the press conferences that they're having for the task force on the pandemic. There is some corporate entity or CEO who jumps in front of the camera and gives a message. That's a powerful tool for the president. He's constantly talking about, yes, protecting public health, but almost equally or more so most days, talking about the need to get America back to business. That's got to be a problem for Joe Biden as well.
That is. And it's not only that it's a problem in that Donald Trump is sort of sucking up that portion of the donor class, but it's also the fact that even if nobody gave to Trump anymore from now until the election, it's still hard to see any path by which Biden would be able to substantially close that gap. He's in a little bit of a better position than would ordinarily be the case because he is getting free media attention as sort of the alternative voice to how to handle this pandemic. But, the way that Donald Trump was using rallies, he's now using his press conferences. And all of America, even people that wouldn't have tuned into the rallies, are watching. The fact that he's talking about these press conferences in terms of ratings is perfect evidence that he believes that this is a recipe for re-election.
These press conferences have now morphed. They were much more about, they started hoax-like, then they got into get America back to work. Now they are talking about public health implications. He did on Monday talk about the number of deaths that Dr. Fauci has been talking about for a number of weeks. He did talk about the number of cases that are potential across the country. Was that a smart pivot by Trump?
It was, and the formal part of the press conference and the speaking portion, I think, have moved in the direction of what we would expect and are sort of more typical of any administration. When you get to the Q&A, though, it's Trump being Trump, and it's remarkable. Every single day, he manages to be even more offensive to the reporters that are asking him questions than he was the day before. And so I think he's trying to have his cake and eat it, too. He's being the president. He's trying to be a consoler-in-chief initially, and then he segues to the Q&A where he can be candidate Donald Trump and do what he does best.
He and Jim Acosta are not close friends, I'm getting the sense of. He went after Jim Acosta yesterday, as well as a PBS reporter as well.
Yep.
Yeah. And this has become the trend at the end of these press conferences. I would also say, though, these are questions intended to bring out Donald Trump being Donald Trump, I think sometimes.
I think that's exactly right. The challenge, of course, is for the president to rise above that and to say, you know what, this is not the time where I'm going to engage in partisan bickering, or I'm not going to take the bait that a journalist might be throwing at me, because these times are different and I'm going to demonstrate that I really can lead. And time and again, he fails to do that. And no matter how well the press conference goes, at the end, when he gets that question, it's like he can't help himself. And then that becomes, fodder for commentary. So I think it's what everybody has come to expect. I will say that some of the questions that he's been asked, where his response is, that's a nasty question, why aren't you instead congratulating me, are softball questions, or would be softball questions for any other president. The kind of question where you're asked, well, what do you say to America's kids who are scared to go outside? Most presidents would love a question like that. It gives them an opportunity to show empathy, to demonstrate that they're parents, to, highlight that they know what it's like to be a kid out there. And he just blows it time and time again.
Some public polls show that Americans support his response to the pandemic as high as 60%. Do you think that polling is correct? Is that the country rallying around even potentially a flawed president because of the American spirit?
I think there's certainly a rally around the flag effect. I also think we can't know from these polls the extent to which the approval of Donald Trump is the same thing as approval for the response. When you look at the partisan breakdown of people in terms of how they think that the CDC and Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx are doing, there's wide support on both sides of the aisle. And it may very well be that Trump is getting some peripheral credit for that. It's hard to know whether that will translate into a vote on Election Day. My hunch is that it probably won't. Democrats are not going to be, regardless of how well the response goes, Democrats are still going to vote for the Democrat.
George Herbert Walker Bush had approval ratings after the first effort to invade Iraq, I believe in the mid-'80s after that episode. And he, of course, lost in a three-way race to Bill Clinton. And is that potentially what plays out in this election?
Well, I think so. Also, remember that the main reason he lost to Bill Clinton was because of the famous "it's the economy, stupid." And it's going to be the economy stupid this time around, too, maybe for a different reason. No one would have expected a pandemic like this. Nobody would have expected the kind of economic uncertainty and basically shattered economy that we're experiencing. But at the end of the day, even if the response is solid, people are going to be looking around and realizing that they're living in a very, very different world now. And the incumbent administration typically bears the brunt for that different kind of world.
The senior senator from Vermont says in the New York Times that he sees a thin pathway to potentially still winning the Democratic nomination. Your thoughts on Senator Sanders?
I do not see that pathway, especially given that we're not having any primaries for a while. So, he's not in a position where he can actually build any kind of momentum or garner any kind of coverage that would allow him to pursue that path that he apparently sees. The other thing I would note is that Joe Biden is basically being treated as the presumptive nominee. When CNN is holding a town hall, it's from Joe Biden's backyard, not from Bernie Sanders' backyard, as the alternative to Donald Trump. And so, those circumstances make it that much more difficult for Sanders. I think in the best of all worlds, when the primaries would have taken part on the day they were supposed to occur, Sanders still would have had to win about 70% of the vote in the remaining races in order to garner a majority of the delegates. I just don't see any way that can happen.
Goldman Sachs sees GDP in the second quarter losing 34%, I think is the number, but in the third quarter leaping up 17%. Is that bounce back of the economy that many economists, Wall Street types, are predicting enough to make President Trump a very difficult candidate to beat?
I think a lot depends on what the summer looks like in terms of people literally being able to get out of their house and get back to work. And it's not just economic forecasts, it's also the day-to-day. And if it turns out that this pandemic actually is moving in waves, and as a result, we're all going to have to continue to social distance, we're all going to have to sort of stay in, even when these epicenters sort of get it under control because it's moving to a different location, I just think that that becomes more important than these broad forecasts. And I can also tell you that people are looking around and they're worried about spending money. They are not going to do the kinds of things that are required to generate the kind of economic boost that we need. I see it in my own life. I'm petrified to order takeout because I don't know where that container has been. I would ordinarily order food 4 or 5 times a week, and now I'm ordering it 0 times.
The Justice Department, it's reported that the Justice Department has started a probe into the action of at least one senator's, quote, insider trading relative to garnering confidential Senate briefing information about the oncoming pandemic and then making certain financial transactions. 3 other senators have also been linked to that action, both Democrats and Republicans, or 1 Democrat, 3 Republicans. That got kind of glossed over in the stimulus. It's now coming back around. If that Justice Department probe gets any momentum behind it, is that a big problem for all of Congress?
I think it feeds into this general idea that Congress is out for itself and not for the American people. And if it turns out that the probe reveals not only insider trading, but insider trading in the worst possible way, right? It's at the expense of actual American lives. I think that puts the entire institution in a pretty tough position. I would also, under ordinary circumstances, if this situation wasn't as sort of horrible as it is, I would have expected resignations by this point, because this is not the kind of story that goes away. I will say there does seem to be a little bit of a distinction between having actually attended the briefing and getting the information and engaging in trading versus a blind trust that does your trading on behalf of you and you weren't at the briefing yourself. So I think that Inhofe and Feinstein might be a little bit more inoculated against these accusations than the other 2.
And is it just the club nature of the United States Senate that other senators have functionally not uttered a word?
Yeah, I mean, I think the norm is that until there's an investigation underway or until there are real findings, you tend not to approach those topics. The other thing is that any senator, and frankly, any member of Congress right now that's talking about anything other than the coronavirus looks like he or she is playing politics, and that's not very useful either. So right now, anybody that engaged in any bad behavior, this is the time that you want it to come out, because this is not the time where you're going to probably be taking the kind of heat that you would under different circumstances.
The stimulus came out with some Christmas ornaments on it. The Kennedy Center got $25 million, and then almost simultaneously laid off their entire staff. Is it just that Congress can't break that behavior? Is it in the DNA of once elected to the United States Senate or the House that you just have to add some silly provision on in kind of blindly understanding where America is?
Well, there are a couple of things. First, didn't you see, Donald Trump said he wishes he could go see Romeo and Juliet right now. He was a big proponent of the Kennedy Center funding. I would say 2 things. The first is that funding for the arts in general has taken a hit in terms of the stimulus bill. But the reality is people are watching TV and watching movies and streaming entertainment probably more than they ever have before. And that's part of that funding. The other thing that I would say in terms of earmarks or sort of Christmas tree bills, it's a way to get things done. This is one of those packages where it had to pass, and it had to pass pretty much unanimously. And if a way to do that is to provide a goodie here and a goodie there to get somebody who would ordinarily be an obstructionist on board, if not now, when? So, it's not an ideal way to legislate. And backroom deals are always a little bit untoward, but given the circumstances here, if Americans are ever going to forgive an earmark or, log rolling, this seems to be the time.
You worked both earmarking and log rolling into the same answer. That's pretty good.
I try.
What's the next stimulus going to look like, and when's it coming?
I think it's difficult to know. My sense is that we'll know a lot more in 15 days. Because in 15 days, a lot of the states will be making their updated decisions about what their social distancing rules are, about whether they're having stay-at-home orders. We know that the federal stay-at-home guidelines are in effect until April 30th, but again, April 15th will be when the federal government sort of releases its next set of plans. So my bet is that in about 2 weeks, we'll know a little bit more about what to expect timeline-wise, not only as far as when people can go back to work, but also as far as when they can expect another check.
Do they go back to work? Will work functionally just be completely changed? This pandemic is not going to be over. It may have a lull in the summer that public health officials are hoping for, that at least dissipates a little bit to allow the country to catch up and develop some better strategies. But are folks going to go and work in the same type of cubicle life as they did previously?
I don't think so. I think there are a lot of jobs where it's become clear that working remotely is feasible, and that could ultimately be a lot more cost effective for companies as well, if they don't need as much infrastructure. I also think that as long as there's the possibility and in fact probability that we're going to see a second wave of this, there's going to be a very, very slow trickle back. And so my bet is that it's not going to be for, the fall is not going to look like the fall normally looks. Maybe next year at this time we'll sort of be back to normal, although normal won't look the same. But certainly I don't think that when the economy opens up again, or when Trump says when Americans get back to work, it's going to be crowded subways and, a lot of traffic in Los Angeles and packed buildings. It's not going to look like that anymore.
And finally, what else should people know? What else do you think that Rhode Islanders need to know about what you see on the political horizons?
I mean, the one thing that's interesting to me is the discussions by governors coming, and Gina Raimondo is a perfect example with the conversation with Andrew Cuomo over the weekend, where she issued this New Yorker stay out order and he got her to rescind it. I think that something that I'm finding really fascinating is these conversations between and among governors, where they're trying to coordinate their responses because they're not able to get the kind of coordinated response that they're expecting from the top down. And so this is one of those opportunities, I think, for federalism to really work well. But, at some point, if you have a governor that's not willing to play along, you really need Donald Trump and the federal government to step in and say you don't have a choice. And I have a feeling that as more and more of the country is affected by this, and more Republican governors are involved in these kinds of decisions, the need for Trump to be a little bit more demanding about what social distancing looks like is going to increase. And my bet is that in the next week, we're going to start to see more harsh rhetoric coming down from the administration.
One of the more interesting things that took place, I think, last night was Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. coming to a common strategy, one state led by a Democrat, one state led by a Republican. That's kind of the first in the country. Although Rhode Island and Massachusetts clearly have been working, Charlie Baker and Gina Raimondo have had a longstanding close relationship, and they clearly have been talking to each other on strategies to be able to lighten the impact.
Right, and Larry Hogan, for a Republican as the Republican governor in Maryland, also has a pretty good relationship with Democrats. So the two examples of Republican governors that we have coordinating with Democrats are the two that we would probably expect nationwide to be doing that.
What's your biggest worry on this entire episode before we go?
That concerns about the economy are going to lead to bigger public health risks, and that people are going to be told that it's okay to start relaxing some of these restrictions. And if that's the case, I don't see how we ever get out of this mess.
Jennifer Lawless, professor, University of Virginia, thank you for taking the time. Please be safe in New York City. We appreciate you Skyping in. Everyone else, thanks very much. We'll keep you updated. More things are breaking today in Rhode Island. Stay tuned for more updates. Thank you.
Thanks.